really excited now. We're going to have some fantastic guests. I've been told they've never been together in the same room speaking about foundations of paper, which is fantastic to have for us. It's a great experience. I'm sure everyone here has already heard of foundations, but if you haven't, the essay kind of took the UK by storm. It's an essay that fundamentally argues a relatively kind of simple reason for the UK's continued stagnation, and that is fundamentally because we have banned the investment in housing, transport, and energy. The trio now work together in Works in Progress, which very much aligned to the core aim of LFG as a magazine of new and underrated ideas to improve the world. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Ben Southwood, Hughes and Sam Bowman. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. As I kind of already set up, Foundations was a massively successful essay you wrote. And I guess it's, people write these various pieces and things, but what was in your mind when you were writing it? What led you to actually write it? And did you expect the reception you got at the end of the day?
Well, yes, we did expect the reception that it got. The three of us have been... I did. Everybody knows that the country is in an unbelievably bad condition. And I think lots and lots of other people, not just us, have had thoughts about different elements of why things aren't working. And all we really did was draw those different elements together. There's a lot of work by Sam Dimitriou and Ben Hopkinson on things like on trams and nuclear power stations. But the reason that I felt so confident was what we're saying really makes sense. And what we're saying, I think, directly addresses the kind of empty words that we get from all parties about things like investment. There's constantly this idea that we don't invest enough. And to the people who say that, investment is like numbers on a page. We're not spending enough money, therefore we have a problem. All we were doing was flipping that around and saying, it isn't the money that goes in that's the problem. It's the stuff that we get out that's the problem. It's the stuff that we're not getting. Houses, nuclear power stations, roads, railways, that's investment. That's the stuff we should care about. And if you ban that stuff, it's not a surprise that you have a problem with it.
Do you share this? Do you guys both share as well? Were you equally kind of ready for it? Do you feel like the energy, the vibe in the ecosystem was that this kind of thing was timed well, it had a good, clear message that it was going to get across? Or were you a little bit more taken by?
I mean, I was very proud of it as a piece of writing, but I have no feeling for audience at all. I was totally bowled over. Sam and Ben were full of confidence. They knew exactly what it needed to be. They told me exactly what to do. It's like, guys, this is a gigantic column of text, 70,000 words or so, and you're expecting people who have no responsibility to work their way through it are going to do so. That's just totally deluded.
I think what was funny was Samuel really wanted to release it through a think tank. And I thought, well, that's very good. I like think tanks. Think tanks are great. But I really, really wanted to release it as a standalone thing, as its own brand with its own website, because I think that the ideas that are in it basically stand by themselves. And I think what we've seen since then, about 1/3 people have read Foundations. And, a lot of them have actually read it. You can see the kind of time on page. And often when you write a long article, you get like a 30-second or 60-second time on page. For us, I think the average is about 12 minutes, which implies that a lot of people are reading all the way to the end. And that's not an unsubstantial share of the British population. And it was really this, we did do a few things. We teed up a lot of people to promote it on the internet, on Twitter and things like that. We took advantage of the fact the algorithm gives you a 4-hour window at the beginning. And if you get a lot of traction there, then you're golden. But I think we knew that what we had was really important and really saying something to a question that is clearly on a lot of people's minds.
I think what I learned was that there is a broad appetite for serious engagement with policy in a way that the traditional think tanks are not set up to access at all, which is not a criticism. They're very specifically targeted at reaching an audience of a few hundred people, key people in Westminster indexed to each paper. But virtually anyone looking at a think tank paper, I think, great. They may think, great, I'm delighted that's published, I'm going to retweet it, I'm going to say it ought to be in the newspaper, and I'm not going to read it. That's a PDF from a think tank is a thing I'm definitely not going to work my way through. And that gives the impression that people only really want what they get on Twitter or what they get in the newspapers, but in fact there's like far more appetite for sustained, serious policy work and far more interest in a lot of these questions than I had appreciated. Though, as I say, Sam and Ben had worked this all out in advance.
We used a few little tricks that are kind of like cheats as well that make something more compelling, and everyone is free to steal these because I think that would make it more enjoyable to read a lot of stuff out there. For example, bullet-pointed lists, very enjoyable to read. Sam was adamant there should be a bullet-pointed list of the coolest facts we had, like 8 of them, 10 of them at the start, and he was completely right because a lot of people shared specifically those bullet points from the very beginning. But I think in general, when we are editing articles, one of the things we tell all of our authors is that you want a mixture of compelling individual facts or anecdotes, which make people feel really that they get the idea that's going. Then you want an abstract story as well, like a logical explanation of the mechanism going on. And then you also want some kind of data, hard stats, facts to back it up. And I think we did all of that stuff. But I mean, that was deliberate. We spent 6 months doing things like that to tweak it so that it was the best thing we had written.
The other trick is that it's quite patriotic. Both Ben and I are used to writing in reasonably cold, economistic ways. Samuel is, I think, probably the best writer I've ever worked with, and I work with a lot of writers. And something that Samuel brought, among many things, was a sense of romance and a sense of pride and a sense that it really does matter to talk about things like housing, economic growth, and so on, in a historical context of times not just when Britain has been great, but when Britain has been on its knees in the past. So we have, I think, an extraordinary bit on the 1920s where Britain, as it is now, was in a terrible way. Really, rent controls, which we're about to get, economic stagnation, really, in many ways, a basket case. And then in a few years, a reforming government came in and changed everything, abolished the rent controls, unleashed a gigantic boom of house building, built the national grid, the first national grid in the world, was built here in Britain in this period, and in the process allowed the country to rearm and prepare for the fight and eventual victory against Germany. And having that in mind, I think, is really important because it shows you not just that this is a great country and this can be a great country, but that we have been on our knees in the past and we have fixed things much, much faster than I think most people appreciate is possible.
I'm allowed to puff it because it wasn't my writing, it was Samuel's, which is the final line I always like. Just before the hidden Easter egg of Kate Nash's Foundations that plays if you get to the very bottom and press the go button.
We never got the rights license for that, though, so don't tell people.
But just before that, Samuel writes, "We've done it before, we can do it again." And I always think, yeah, when I read that, even myself reading it back, I'm like, yes, Samuel, you are completely right. We can do it again.
When you talk about patriotism as well, is that why there was such a specific focus on French and how well they're doing in terms of their nuclear problem?
I mean, the French thing I think is useful. The patriotism part of it is important too.
Yeah.
There are some people where they'll think, we really got to get them. It sucks that they're outdoing us. But I think also there's a bigger thing of people look at these charts of GDP and then they're thinking, like, we've got all these problems. But ultimately, we have the same GDP per capita as France. We're about the same productivity as France. Things are roughly the same as France. So one conclusion you might draw is nothing matters. It's always basically determined that we're going to have this level. There's nothing we can change. There's nothing we can really do. And I've heard very senior politicians effectively say something like this, saying that, it's all in the game. Whatever happens, we're ultimately going to end up with GDP per capita roughly the same as France. But I think it's actually quite confusing if you learn about how economies work, you study all the different effects of different reforms, and then France has implemented a bunch of extremely bad policies. Like, across the board, there are really remarkable facts. Like when we were writing Foundations, Sam worked out that, do you remember the numbers more closely? I'm going to get it, but I'm going to get them slightly wrong, of how much you have to pay someone to get a £60,000 salary.
I won't try to make up the numbers, but the wedge, basically, the amount of tax that has to be paid for people to bring home the equivalent amount of money in Britain versus France is twice as high in France. And this is for somebody to take home about £66,000 a year, right? Twice as high. And this is all hidden on the side of employer side social security contributions in France. So if you go to an income tax calculator and you look it up, you won't see this. But if you actually do the maths, and I've checked this with some people who certainly know their stuff at the OECD and in Paris, the wedge is double what it is there. So they have unbelievable problems. Like France is pretty much the only country in Europe that I think is clearly more of a basket case economically than Britain right now. Maybe there are a few other contenders, but France is definitely the worst. And yet, as Ben says, it's at least as prosperous as Britain in the long run. And that's a really, really important question, that given that we're so similar, and given that we have we have almost the same population, we have a very, very similar kind of overall wealth level, that's a really, really important thing to understand. And I think this insight that they just build things over there. You know, they built 50 nuclear reactors in a decade in the 1970s and 80s. That's incredible, right? That's absolutely incredible. And the fact that we don't really find that amazing and fascinating and kind of want to copy that.
They rebuilt Notre Dame as well, and they're
years.
incredibly proud
impressive.
of that, which I think they should be. But my gosh, could we do that here?
So in 1990, since 1990, France has built more extra motorways than the entire size of the UK's motorway network. And in the 1970s, they built 3 crossrails. Like, we're just catching up with 1. They already built 3, maybe 4. There are so many cases. I mean, if you go to any French small town city, you will just notice the extent. Sometimes it's a bad thing. Sometimes their countryside is less well kept. You know, there are trade-offs involved here, but there's more big box shopping, retail areas and industrial areas outside smaller French cities, but it's extremely noticeable. The other one that I thought was a good statistic is that in 1938 and 1939, builders in London, who were building at the highest rate we have ever had before or since, builders in London dropped down tools to go and work in the arms industries or go away to war. Many of those roads are still dead ends into fields now and were never picked up. And the overall area of London has gone up by about, if you take out Heathrow, which was added to the total, it's gone up by about 1%, maybe 1.5%. Paris has gone up 300% during the same time since then. So the extent to which they allowed cities to grow outwards in France is just dramatically different. There weren't green belts, for example.
My France anecdote from I've given a talk not so unlike this in Rennes in Brittany recently. It's a town about the size of Lincoln, which has its own metro system. Totally, not just a light rail system, a proper underground metro. That's absolutely astonishing. Beautifully kept town, extremely good condition, masses of new housing. That, on the other hand, just after my talk was over, the Master of Ceremonies comes in and says, "Yeah, thank you for your talk, Dr. Hughes. Unfortunately, riots have broken out in the city centre and the gendarmes have told us that they've lost control. So the conference centre is now being locked down. If you wish to leave now, the gendarme will convoy you out of the city centre. And if not, you're going to be stuck here until some unspecified point when the authorities restore order." I thought, wow, look at this remarkable country. They're so good at some things, even though in other respects it's like much more of a mess than this country. So that was the idea. Like, this place so close to us that we feel we know quite well, and which in fact throws into relief just how badly we've done on these 3 core areas: energy, infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and housing.
I love these, sorry, Becca. Sorry, please.
So it's quite interesting that you focus so much on the patriotic element of it. I was wondering, did you have it in the bank for a while? Was it something that you specifically released at a certain time? Do you kind of wish that you'd written Foundations earlier? Do you wish you'd released it later? I mean, it's got great press, so must be pretty happy with it anyway.
I think in a way we've had elements of it in the bank for 10 years. You know, all of us have been writing on and off about, especially housing. You know, Ben and I are co-authors of the Housing Theory of Everything, and some of the ideas that are in that are also in Foundations. And some of it was brand new. You know, I really hadn't quite understood quite how broken the energy market was until we came to Foundations and said, you know, we really do want to talk about the economic building blocks, and we can't just, that isn't just cities and people and agglomeration. That is also making things and industrial production and ultimately energy. So some of it was learning as we went. Some of it was drawing on things we had written, you know, now almost a decade ago. I think that it was the right time to release it. I do sense that something very important has shifted and I certainly wouldn't claim to be more than a tiny part of that, where now any serious person I speak to, whether they're Labour, Reform, Conservatives, even some of the other parties, will accept the basic point that a shortage of housing, good infrastructure, and energy is the problem. Now, we might disagree about how to get that shortage unblocked, and that's fine. You know, the point of foundations is not to say we need let the market rip or anything like that. It's occasionally misunderstood.
And agree with it vocally too. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I feel like MPs have kind of known about that for a while. We have got a housing shortage, but being able to go out and say, actually, we need to do something
Yeah,
about this there's a big difference there.
The only question in my mind is whether we should have been a little bit more subtle about our own political beliefs. So we are very clearly, we praise Thatcher, we praise privatization, because that is a period where the country, not the only one, but that is a period where the country was on its knees and turned around very rapidly, clearly with some downsides as well. We're critical of Attlee. We are pretty open that we think that state-led approaches to house building haven't worked. And I think it's possible that we might have had a wider net had we been less forthright about that. But I think it would have come at the cost of honesty and sincerity. And I actually think when I speak to people on the left and on the centre left who've read Foundations, even though they don't agree with that much of it, or that element of it, I should say, that part of it, they respect that we're open about where we're coming from. And almost all of them are bright enough and clear thinking enough to realize we don't need to agree on every single point. We just need to agree on the important things.
This like comes back right to the critical thing of like you feel like you've changed the vibe of the thought. Like people are now accepting this point of okay, wait, across party lines, infrastructure, housing, etc. There's something wrong here, and it was great. Look, PM came out and said he was a YIMBY. You have the 1.5 million homes pledge, but again, you're seeing like the same kind of failure mode that seems to be hitting the politicians, right? You've got. I mean, today they announced that they approved Heathrow, and I had to message our group chat to say I thought they had already approved Heathrow, and apparently no, this is another part of Heathrow approval they have to do in this Parliament. And it's like, can we not get these decisions through? So like, clearly it's something you want to do now. Why is it taking so long? And with the 1.5 million homes, we're obviously off target of that, and yeah, they seem to be on kind of core policies. So focusing first on not the policy changes, which we'll come to, but like people in this room, like the frustrations that people are feeling, what would you say is, what can we do? Like politicians act to the response of the public, and too often have they felt that actually the public and their voter base is very much against infrastructure, and that's where they're leaning. And you speak to politicians and they're like, give me a bit of help here, and I'll champion it. But currently, right now, they're just getting hit by the other side. So what would you kind of suggest to people in the room of like, what's the most kind of effective things you can do to push that?
So there are a lot of different things there. I am going to answer on just one narrow part of it, because I think there are a lot of, I think that, for example, I think that the most useful thing that people in the room can do is probably to fight bad things that are being suggested. I think that coordinated, or even uncoordinated, but just lots of people emailing their MP or sending a letter to their MP that some new change is bad when the bad stuff is happening can be quite effective. I think that you have to be much more organised if you want to actually proactively change things rather than prevent a bad change. And that would, like, things like LFG are going to be the best way, like being involved and doing stuff like that is going to be the best way for proactive changes. But for reactive changes, I think that just individual people can make a huge difference by responding. But the thing I was going to respond on infrastructure. I think that infrastructure planning is just generally really complex and hard. And there are lots of ways in which we failed. So I tend to think, let's look around the world and in our history at when we have been building infrastructure well. Look at what things we have done that have been successful. When has it been cheap? When has it been quick? When has it been popular? When have we done lots of it in one go? And for transport infrastructure, which I know best, basically things were kind of working until the 1990s. If you look at the 1970s, quite a lot of cool stuff was built. You had the Victoria Line being built. The Victoria Line was extremely cheap. In modern money, it was like less than 10 times cheaper per mile than Crossrail. And even the southern extension of the Victoria Line, which was built with the Great Head Shield method, so it's the original way of building tunnels from the 1850s, where like Thomas Greathead, who was a contemporary of Mark Brunel, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's father, basically you go into a hole, you build up a wooden blockage thing called the Great Head Shield, then you get the dirt out, then you move the shield in a bit more, and through that method they did like 7 feet a day to build the Rotherhithe Tunnel, which was the first tunnel of any kind under a river. Anyway, they used that method in the 1970s to build the southern extension to the Victoria Line, and it was still dramatically cheaper than anything they do today. And I suspect that the reason why these 1970s projects were relatively successful, like the Victoria Line extension, the Tyne and Wear Metro in Newcastle, the Liverpool Metro, so they built 2 tunnels to turn Liverpool's pre-existing railways into crossrails in the 1970s, and a bunch of other stuff, is because they were significantly locally funded and locally directed. So it used to be the case that local governments in the UK basically had the powers necessary and the funding streams necessary to proactively deliver infrastructure projects. And if you look around the world where they still do infrastructure well today, I think we look at France, we look at Spain, maybe Italy to some extent, maybe Germany, all of these countries, local governments both direct, plan, and come up with, and also fund very significant portions. So in France, it would usually be about 50%, often more. In Spain, the Madrid Metro, which is like probably the world's most successful ever build-out, was entirely self-funded by the community of Madrid. And there's one other option, which is privatization. In Japan, the railways are nearly all private. There are some small counterexamples. They still build out quite a lot of stuff. They do good direct coordination between different providers. I'm not sure if that would work here because of the details, but basically I think look around the world, infrastructure is unsuccessful because we're not doing it the same way we used to do it in the past, and where they're still doing it successfully. So for transport infrastructure.
So here's what I'll say. I'll say 2 things. Number one, you would be really surprised at how effective tweets are, even if you don't have a lot of followers. Dominic Cummings has this, famous line, "There are no ninjas." You go into a government department, there's no room where all the ninjas are doing the important things. It's just normal people all the way up, and there are not that many of them. And those normal people run their own Twitter accounts. And like all of us, when they see a lot of people replying to them saying, "Probably not, you're an idiot, but you should read this says that you're wrong," etc., they actually do pay attention to that, and they actually do listen to that. There was a famous case a couple of weeks ago in the US where somebody took a photograph of I think the Secretary of Agriculture's phone, and he had received a text message from one of his subordinates saying, "Oh, we should check out this thing," and it was sharing a tweet from somebody with like 200 followers that just said, "Oh, you're making a huge mistake on pork belly futures," or something like that. So tweeting really actually is very, very important and influential, even if you don't have a lot of followers, and I think even if you're an anonymous account. The other thing I'll say is, what should people focus on? To be honest, I don't think that people tweeting their MP is going to make a huge difference on things like housing bills and things like that. It's probably worth doing. I do think that the renter reform bill that is coming through, and it might be too late, is going to be absolutely disastrous. I think we're bringing in rent controls basically without anybody realizing. It makes me weep for the competence of the people involved in this. And by the way, this is a bipartisan bill. This was introduced by the Conservatives, and it's being brought to fruition by Labour. And what this does is basically make it impossible to kick out a tenant, except under a very, very narrow set of circumstances, with permission from a tribunal. But it also allows the tenant to challenge your rent increases, not just within a tenancy, which is a form of rent control, but also at the beginning of a tenancy, which is the worst kind of rent control, where you actually have no market rate for a tribunal to refer to. I think this is potentially absolutely catastrophic for the market. It will be de facto rent controls for the rental market, and it will cause huge numbers of properties to leave the rental market into the owner-occupied market, which is going to be disastrous for people who need a place to rent. So the number one thing I think people in this room can do is push back on this, tell your MP, tweet, tell via any methods you can, say you are making a huge mistake and this is going to blow up in your faces and we're going to be left with the consequences of it.
This is such an important issue for many of our audience who, tend to be younger as well, but rent is crazy expensive. Can you explain a bit more of why, for those who aren't familiar with rent controls, why that would push their rent up?
So rent controls are bad for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is if you keep the rent artificially low, the homeowner, the person who actually owns the property, the landlord, can at some point make more money by just selling the home rather than, because there are not house price controls. That would be a bad idea for other reasons, but nobody's proposing those. So there's a certain point where it just no longer makes any sense. That's also true if you have to keep a certain tenant in there who you don't want in there. You know, they're annoying or they're worse than annoying, but you can't convince a tribunal to get rid of them, and it's very expensive to convince a tribunal to get rid of them. Rent controls are bad for the tenants. So the first thing is lots of houses leave the market, so the market shrinks, and you have more people who want to rent than there are rental properties available. We already have that problem because we have a housing shortage. This is going to make that worse. The second thing, rent controls keep the price of rents way below the market rent, which means that landlords don't have to actually do the basic things that landlords need to do to keep people in their properties. Now, I know everybody's thinking, or many people may be thinking, my landlord's terrible, they never do the basic things anyway, but wait until you see places that have had rent controls. The famous line by the Swedish economist is that rent controls are the only thing, or the only thing worse for rent controls, worse for cities than rent controls, is bombing. And what you end up with is properties being neglected. There's no benefit to the landlord in fixing a boiler, fixing a leak, fixing broken windows. They can fall into an immense state of disrepair.
It goes even deeper than this. So France introduced, well, loads of countries introduced very, very strict rent controls during the First World War. France kept its on longer, and they had them still at the end of the Second World War, and French houses basically didn't have indoor toilets. Like, I don't know, Samuel, you may have the number?
Like 6% of them had indoor toilets in 1950?
Yeah, 6% of French houses had indoor toilets in 1950. But it's even more severe than this. So when you have rent control, it's basically hard to build apartments at all, right? Because the alternatives to renting out apartments are not that good. You can't have freeholds, obviously, because you're in a big building together. Leasehold, people don't like it for all the reasons that we know about at the moment. In many countries, condominiums, which are the kind of share of freehold thing, don't exist, and many people can't get the money for them. So what you often have is basically no flat building at all for decades, and that happened in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, that is what happened in, say, France in the 1920s. That's why France switches so drastically. You know, like, the Paris you know from being a tourist, this like very dense, built up to 8 stories, they're all built rental blocks. 1920, they bring in rent controls. It becomes totally in the First World War, they bring in rent controls. It becomes totally unprofitable to build to let. They don't really have any system at that time for shared ownership of these buildings. So there basically is no profitable way for the private market to build flats. And so either they just build nothing or they build small, very poor quality homes for owner-occupiers in the interwar period. Total catastrophe in interwar France. And we're sort of in that position in London now. So incipient rent controls through renters reform. Our historic system for multiple ownership of buildings is the leasehold system. That's also being torn apart through leasehold reform, which is making it like you'd have to be mad to invest in freehold ownership at the moment when you know that your leasehold tenants can expropriate the freeholds at sub-market rates and can extend their leases at sub-market rates. So it's really not very clear what the correct model is for building flats in London. Ultimately, the government wants people to switch over to common hold, which is a kind of condominium ownership. But the common hold system it was created 20 years ago, but it doesn't really work. It hasn't been drafted correctly. There are a bunch of reforms that people sort of know what they need to do to fix it, but they haven't actually been done yet. And now they've raced ahead with wrecking all the existing systems of tenure without getting a new system in place. So we're kind of in the France 1914.
And this is presumably why there are basically no houses being built in London. There are no large buildings being built in London right now.
That's why there's a specific phenomenon of housing starts collapsing in London and not really collapsing in the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, housing starts are stable. The Greenbelt reforms the government has done are actually quite substantial reforms. People they don't take the government seriously anymore, but if you actually look at the changes in national planning policy, they're quite real changes. And we know, like, every private planner in the country is furiously working at the moment, preparing applications to get housing through in greenbelts. So it's like, there isn't a general collapse of the housing sector. There's a specific collapse of really like the London sector, and maybe the sector in a few other major cities. And that's the result of demand-side breakdown because of leasehold, renters reform. I think some of the stuff about non-doms has affected London. And then some specific the GLA policies and the building safety stuff that's come through. like particular collapse that's happened on flats, and because we build so many more flats in London, London's thus taken the hit. That, of course, is a disaster, a particular disaster, because London is where the housing shortage is concentrated. Really, the national housing shortage is more or less like the housing shortage of London, Oxford, Cambridge, and their satellite towns, which they then, because they don't solve it in those places, they export some of their housing shortage to other bits of the country. But like, we're not solving, like, housing is getting worse in the place where it's most vital for it to get better.
And this is all before the rental reform bill has come in. I'm a really big believer that you only need to fix a few things in this country and we'll be back on our feet. But that doesn't mean that we haven't got a huge number of other things to address. And the real takeaway for me for the rental reform bill isn't just that we're about to break the housing market. It's that we have a completely broken way of running the country. We have a Lords that's supposed to be an expert committee that reviewed this bill and had no objections. We have a Conservative Party.
Really noticed that it was actually rent control.
Didn't notice that it was rent control, so supposedly kind of expert review function of the Lords did not happen. We have a civil service that has not realised this. We have a Conservative Party that actually brought the bill forward, and now we have a Labour Party bringing it in. Almost every single level here has failed, and I fear that what we see in London at the moment is just the start of a much, much worse problem, thanks to this bill.
We've got a few minutes left. Thank you. We've got a few minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions I really want to ask. One is, okay, we hear this problem. Steve Reed came out, I think it was this week, if my timing's right, and he said his job is on the line for 1.5 million homes. Very clear. I mean, technically, the 1.5 million homes is at the end of election, so his job's at the line anyway. But he's very adamant this is his mission to get done. Now, let's fast forward 2 years, and we're in 2027. Steve Reed is looking at the numbers. He's realizing, oh, wait, I'm never going to meet this target. What should I have done? He brings in you three guys, sit down, and you've got the obligatory 30 seconds to quickly tell him. And he just wants to know, what should have I done? What should I have done in October 2025? What would you tell him?
Well, I mean, so there's a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about, clearly, like, don't do renters reform, either don't do leasehold reform, or very, very swiftly sort out the common hold system so you have a working system for multiple ownership of buildings. They're going to have to do something about the mad building safety stuff that's come through.
I'll ask one really quick, spicy question, just a yes or no answer to. But do you think it's time to repeal the Town and Country Planning Act 1947?
It's a misnomer. The Town and Country Planning Act is not the problem. There were several things done at the same time, like introducing the green belts, not part of the Town and Country Planning Act, big problem. But basically the powers in the Town and Country Planning Act already existed, most of them. It kind of firmed them up slightly, but that's not a big problem. The problem is that no local government in the country has any incentive to permit housing. Those were taken away at the same time as the introduction of the Town and Country Planning Act. If we can restore incentives, then we can get the extremely permissive system we had before the Second World War. We can get it back.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Samuel.
Then the other thing, I mean, this is a heretical view that I've gradually come to, is lots of kinds of development control are actually very popular. And like, what we want is not really to like strip out planning entirely and have like a crazy like affluent slum kind of, you want is a highly planned city, like the cities of Spain, for example, the Netherlands. You just want it to be like plan a huge amount of building rather than plan a huge amount of not building.
Very fair. We are obviously in London, if you hadn't noticed. We're in the lovely O2, Indigo at the O2. So, London, I think as you mentioned there, it's kind of, house building is collapsing. I think you mentioned earlier, Ben, that we haven't actually had a planning application since July.
I believe the building safety regulator has not received any application, so that means a building above like 18 meters since July in London.
Which is crazy for our capital city, like this kind of central hub. Sam, I may turn to you for the last question around what do you think we need to do to improve London, to get off the trajectory and to get us improving?
All right, well, let me give a kind of off-field or left-field suggestion, which is I think Lawrence Newport should run for mayor. I think that basically there has never been a more open mayoral field. Labour is completely discredited. If Sadiq runs again, he's going to be the most unpopular incumbent in London history. Maybe there'll be a Your Party, Jeremy Corbyn candidacy from the left. Reform are not going to stand down, so they're going to run somebody. The Tories are not going to stand down, so they're going to run somebody. There's never been a better time for somebody to come in, and I think there's never been a more important time for somebody to focus on growth, and I mean that in every sense, not just economic growth, but people, more houses, bringing in more people from the rest of the country. And, you know, London is right now a city of about 10 million people. I'd like it to be a city of about 20 million people. Why can't it be Tokyo or New York City?
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much, guys, for joining us. It's been fantastic to have you on here. I hope you've all enjoyed it. We're going to take a little break before the show starts, but can I just get a warm round of applause for our 3 guests taking the time? Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the night.